All right. Some of you have heard some of this before, but for those of you who haven't, I'm just going to run through it anyhow, the intro, okay? Appreciate all my students from the class being here tonight. Good evening to all of you, and we really welcome you to this event. I'm Phyllis Jackson from the Art History Department here at Pomona. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay. Hopefully all of you have or will soon visit the exhibition Todd Gray, Euclidean Grigri. Euclidean Grigri is the very last exhibition to grace the walls of the Pomona College Museum of Art. The museum's closing next spring will mark the end of an era and the rise of a new museological profile. Did I touch something? Museological profile. As the museum staff transitions to opening the new museum, or the new Benton Museum of Art at Pomona, in fall of 2020. The current show features the Los Angeles-based artist's recent large-scale photographic work, which is related to the body of work included in the 2019 Whitney Biennial that closes this coming Sunday. Now, if you haven't already seen Todd's show, please consider returning again and again and again. And hopefully you will allow tonight's lecture by Bridget R. to spark new conceptual pathways, expand your intricate web of mental historical markers, and serve as a springboard for producing new historically situated meaning for Todd's visual interrogations of the interconnected visual histories of the contemporary nation of Ghana and the imperial gardens and aristocratic landscapes of colonial Europe. When invited to exhibit at Pomona, Todd Gray encouraged museum curators Rebecca McGrew, with assistance from Hannah Brown, to invite an emerging transdisciplinary scholar, professor, curator, and performance artist, Nana Aduse Poku, to curate a series of exhibition-enhancing events. Nana thematically titled the series of 9 events, Longing on a Large Scale. And I think it's important to note that Todd owns and maintains a studio in Ghana as well as LA, and Nana herself was born in Germany and is of Ghanaian Deutsch ancestry. Exercising curatorial wisdom and historical insight, Nana selected Bridget Cooks to deliver the first lecture in a 2-part kind of mini program within the 9-part series. But this program focuses our critical and longing lens on museums as a site for cultural change, curating with care and careful curation. Bridget Cooks is an associate professor in the Department of Art History and the Department of African American Studies at UC Irvine. This is also where she did her undergrad. And she is currently serving as chair. It's about her 4th or 5th year. Yeah. And she's in a department and holds her own with the intellectual and academic peers such as Frank B. Wilderson III, Jared Sexton, and Nahum Chandler. Wearing many academic hats, Bridget is also core faculty in 3 UCI graduate programs: Visual Studies, Critical Curatorial Studies, as well as Culture and Theory. Born in Hollywood, Bridget was one of the generation of Los Angeles school children federally inscripted into the political struggles to legally dismantle de facto segregation through the social experiment of mandated busing. It's a historical moment remembered and recouped by Kamala Harris during the first set of Democratic debates. Necessarily, since childhood, Bridget Cooks has been embroiled in negotiating and defining the significance of blackness, the politics of representation, the transformative power of visual culture, as well as the physical presence of black bodies and black creative spirits in the construction of our visual imaginary and national art narratives. Frankly, Bridget's scholarly and curatorial practices continue to desegregate hegemonic art world narratives, focus on the work of the museum and exhibiting practices. In 2013, the David C. Driscoll Center for the Study of Visual Art and Culture of African Americans and the African Diaspora at the University of Maryland, College Park established the James A. Porter and David C. Driscoll Book Award in African American Art History. And I think it's really important. You're going to hear a lot of names tonight, and you're going to say, well, who are these people? I'm calling out their names. I'm saying their names, because if you want to understand anything about African American art as it developed, African American art history from the 20th century, names like James A. Porter, David Driscoll, Samela Lewis, Judith Wilson are all important names that paved a way for the work that is being done by Bridget today. But it's also worth noting that she released her book, once again, did I say that yet? No, I'm sorry. Did I? Okay. Bridget Cook's so the Porter Book Award, the Porter Driscoll Book Award, was first created in 2013. And when they created it in 2013, the first book to receive the award was Bridget's 2011 groundbreaking book, Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans and the African... I'm just going to start that sentence again. Okay. Her groundbreaking book, Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans and the American Art Museum, received that first award. And it's worth noting that Professor Cooks released Exhibiting Blackness during the first Barack Obama administration. Disturbing, dreamy liberal narratives asserting the U.S. had matured into a post-racial society. And all of you know what happened in the run-up to the 2016 elections. That notion was completely dismantled. So she's very prescient in her work. Cooks has also published dozens of articles, essays, and catalog chapters, ranging from studies on the work of Harlem Renaissance sculptor and arts educator Augusta Savage, to contemporary painter Titus Kaphar, who paints and reconfigures canonical paintings to center Black figurative visual narratives. In addition, Professor Cooks has established an impressive curatorial record. 3 exhibitions in particular connect thematically to the landscape focus of Todd's show. Her 2009 exhibition, The Art of Richard Mayhew, at the Museum of African Diaspora. And it's actually a really brilliant exhibition because she curated it so that it would take place in 3 sites covering different portions of the artist's career. An artist who Cook deems as one of America's most important abstract landscape artists of the 20th century. In 2018, Bridget highlighted the work of 19th century lithographer turned painter in her exhibition titled Grafton Tyler Brown, Exploring California. It was central to the final exhibition cycle, marking the end of Pasadena Museum of California Art's 17 institutional run, similar to how Todd's show is closing up the Pomona Museum of Art. Her exhibition, Ernie Barnes, a retrospective, ran from May until September 8th of this month at the California African American Museum, affectionately called CAM, in Los Angeles. And for those of you unfamiliar with Barnes' paintings, just imagine a mid-70s artist carving out a creative space by crafting vibrant urban interior landscapes for his work. While exhibitions are somewhat similar to what I think of as the social media app Snapchat. Did I say it right? Snapchat? Because you guys know I don't own a phone, right? In other words, exhibitions are ephemeral, here today, gone tomorrow. But unlike Snapchat's resistance to permanency, art exhibitions, especially those curated by Professor Cooks, construct new chapters for our understanding, our shared creative past, our contested visual present, and serve as guides leading us toward the construction of shared and interconnected visual imaginaries of the future. Bridget's work on Blackness and U.S. art exhibiting practices in the United States of America remind us that artists and curators artists and curators and creative people were often at the forefront of the centuries-long Black radical tradition. Let's give a warm welcome to Bridget Cooks.
Well, my mom is going to be so happy to hear that whole introduction when she plays this at home. Thank you very much, Phyllis, for that. That's very meaningful. It also makes me feel like I am really getting old, too. It's like, oh, yeah, I did all that. Whew. Okay. So I'd like to thank several people. Rebecca McGrew, who's been very kind to me. Terry Geis, also equally as kind. Hannah Grossman, Justine Bay, and of course Phyllis Jackson have all been very welcoming, and I appreciate all the labor you've done to get me here. Nana Aduse Poku, who I met after a series of conversations this Saturday, who's lovely and smart and really part of the future of all of this discourse that we'll be talking about today and for the next year. And of course to Todd Gray, the eternally youthful, overly talented artist. I was going to say photographer, but it's performance, it's all kinds of different forms, and he's just an exquisite person. So I'm really honored to have been asked to be part of this program, Longing on a Large Scale. I wanted to just show this work, and I'll show it again later, Faustian Darkness from 2013. When I saw Todd at the opening on Saturday, he pulled me aside and he said, I want you to know that when I first started to make this new form of work, that you were the first person I called for a studio visit. And I had no idea, and I was really moved by that. The earliest work from this new form of work that he's making is from 2013, and Todd has had so many different, in my mind, careers. He's been in so many different incredible positions, and I've told people already on the back of his Michael Jackson book, because he was the personal photographer for Michael Jackson for a number of years, is a photograph of Todd Gray, and the credit is Andy Warhol. I'm like, really, Todd? Andy Warhol took this picture of you for the back of your book? Like, who's going to do better than that? That's just insane. And so one of the great things about Todd's work that makes it so original and innovative, in addition to the form, is also the content, because these are all photographs that he took, right? So that I can look at this photograph and I immediately see Michael Jackson and Chuck Berry. But he takes their face away and gives us other kinds of information. And these are all kind of scenes from his own life. It's a very generous thing that he does for us as an artist. So anyway, it's wonderful to be here now to celebrate the array of work that he developed for this exhibition, coming from some of the earliest things I saw. Aduse Poku asked me to participate at the beginning of this year-long series of events for Euclidean Gris-Gris because of my research on the history of African Americans in the mainstream art world that Phyllis has kindly introduced you to. And so I'd like to start there as a way to contextualize really where we are now. So several years ago, I wrote this book, Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans in the American Art Museum, which has the following premise. Exhibitions of African American art in American art museums have been curated through two guiding methodologies: the anthropological approach, which displays the difference of racial blackness from the elevated white norm, and the corrective narrative, which aims to present the work of significant and overlooked African American artists to a mainstream audience. The former methodology reflects an institutional curiosity concerning the presence of racial otherness, commonly coupled with the desire to perpetuate the superiority of mainstream white culture through its contrast to a black difference defined as inherently inferior. The latter methodology was formed out of the necessity to present the art of African Americans and correct for its historical absence and misrepresentation in mainstream art museums. So the book provides a context for contemporary exhibitions of art by Black people, like the one by Gray that has brought us together now. And so this evening I'll say a bit more about the anthropological and corrective approaches and discuss through examples how the anthropological approach in particular continues to guide the methodologies of curating today. Finally, through Euclidean Gris-Gris, I'd like us to consider alternative approaches, what we're calling curating with care and careful curation when it comes to presenting the art of Black people. And the presentation of Gray's work here at the Pomona Museum of Art is an example of how exhibitions can be curated with care. And I think particularly, there's different things to say about this. There's a kind of calm that we talked about for those of us who were in the gallery together, a sense of calm. I'm very sensitive to spacing. I don't like exhibitions to be stuffed and look like a garage sale. There's something very elegant about the spacing of the work. And I think in particular the fact that Todd Gray is able to come in and replace works, right? That he can come in and really be hands-on as the artist to work with the curators to really create different experiences for us as the months go on. So I'd also like to posit at the end of my talk, which is not going to keep you here all night, that a key part of the completion of the curatorial process is our responsibility as students of the arts, as viewers, as researchers and writers, to engage and respond to the work. I think that it has to be a full circle, the kind of thing that we were doing in the gallery, a successful conversation of wonder and really listening to each other. I think that is the test of the curatorial process. We are living through historic times when it comes to art museums and the discourse of ethics, decolonization, historical truth, and community engagement. 2 weeks ago, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Met, unveiled 4 bronze sculptures created by Kenyan-American artist Wangechi Mutu. So here's the facade. I'm going to be referring to these. Okay, so there's 4, and I will have details for you. Okay, so this happened this month, okay, September 2019. The sculptures fill 4 architectural alcoves on the outside of the museum building that have sat as empty platforms since its completion in 1902. The commission is the first of a series of annual commissions planned for artists to make new work in response to the Met's collection. The sculptures are reimagined from ancient caryatids in which female forms have been used to hold up the weight of a structure. We think about this with ancient Greek temples. But in this case, Mutu's forms sit independently with authority, without the burden of supporting something else. And the symbolism here, I think, is really magnificent. She shows the black female form as a goddess. I think it's a terrific step towards making changes to the very long and troubled history of colonization at the Met. And we, as viewers, though, have to make the museum accountable so that the artwork does not sit as a gesture, as kind of cosmetic on the outside, but signals the treatment of black people inside the galleries. And I mean that in terms of artists, but also guards, curators, educators, visitors, all of those things. Here are some more pictures. And for scale, I wanted you to see this at the Foundry. So Mutu at the Walla Walla Foundry applying patina to the seated 3. So they're all named the seated 1, 2, 3, and 4. During the same week, ICOM, the International Council of Museums, an organization that represents 20,000 museums across the globe, met in Japan for its annual conference. On the agenda was the vote to officially revise the definition of a museum. The new definition has divided its constituents, some of whom reject the new mission to promote justice in multiple forms for the planet and its people. That's written into the definition of the function of a museum. The new definition states the new active function of museums now, and this is a quotation, museums are democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the past and the futures, end of quote. It also states that the museum should guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people. Considered too radical for many of the council's constituents, ICOM decided to postpone the vote, and there is no date set for the vote to happen. So I'm just showing you from ArtNet, and for those of you that are researchers or want to read the whole thing, that the dates are at the bottom. And we've also been seeing in recent years very organized and visible protests at museums, particularly for the kind of investments that the museums and the board members are engaged in. This past May, the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York faced organized and persistent protest because of the investments of Warren B. Kanders, who served as vice chairman of the museum's board of directors. The protesters, including activists in the group called Decolonize This Place, objected to Kanders' ownership of Safariland, a company that manufactures the tear gas used against immigrants along the Mexico-U.S. border. Many of the artists in the biennial, including Todd Gray, called for Sanders' resignation, which eventually came later this past July. In April of 2018, Christopher Bedford, director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, announced that it would deaccession 7 artworks, all made by white men, in their collection in order to fund the accession of art by white women and artists of color. As a result, Bedford stated later on, the BMA acquired 11 major works of art as part of the museum's strategy to broaden the historical narrative of art and build a more diverse and inclusive art experience for Baltimore. And Baltimore is a chocolate city, meaning that most of the people that live there, a good percentage of them are African American. In February of this year, SF MoMA followed the BMA's lead with the sale of a Rothko to purchase works by makers of different racial and gender identities. And these are bold gestures by these 2 museums, and I appreciate the gesture and a kind of call to arms for there to be change, but they are also unsustainable gestures to change the collection. So I'm hoping for the support of the boards and donors of these museums and others to understand the seriousness of changing the permanent collection and to reconsider and fund a transformational collection and exhibition practice. So we'll see what happens there. In 2017, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio formed a group to consider what should be done about several statues in the city that promote white supremacy. One of these is the troubling sculpture Equestrian Statue of Theodore Roosevelt, which has stood in front of the American Museum of Natural History since 1940. This summer, the museum opened an exhibition called Addressing the Statue. So I'm showing you the statue in front of the building, and then Decolonize This Place, doing an action outside. And we were just looking at that covered bust in the exhibition, so here we can see it again used maybe for a different purpose. A copy of the brochure that was handed out on Columbus Day is when they staged this protest. And then here's the front of the exhibition that's currently on view. So it opened this summer. Addressing the Statue is about the statue, which will remain outside its front doors, at least for now. And it's wonderful to be able to have this dialogue about what to do with the statue, but I also look forward to seeing what happens next, right? We're in the middle of this. What I don't understand is what's taking so long. I mean, to be totally honest, it's like, let's have a show. And it's like, well, so I'm just wondering it's been up there since, it's not a solution to have a show. We'll have a show about it, but it might lead to a solution. So again, I'm wondering what's going to happen next. Okay. So the museum trouble that's going on now is not new, rather it is ongoing. And its history of conflict between upholding white supremacy on one hand and representing people of color respectively as human equals on the other is as old as the museum itself. And the museum was really created as a way to, at least in the United States, there's different histories in France, in India, and other places, but the museum was really created to try to cultivate a kind of proper public behavior for people of the lower classes, right? So we've been saying for several years now how museums are not neutral, and it's important to know why museums were established. That's part of the reason. It's public training for behavior, but also showing off a certain kind of wealth and promoting a particular line of nationalism. So for African American people, we have a very specific, traceable history through exhibitions in museums. Visiting and working in mainstream museums, I found the regular emission of art on view that had been created by Black artists. And when there was an exhibition of work by Black artists, I noticed a few other things. First, Black artists were featured in museums within group exhibitions about Black identity. They were not regularly shown in thematic-based exhibitions organized around a style of art or a specific topic, and rarely was their work shown alongside artists who were not Black. So just to be clear, Black artists were shown in groups to talk about being Black. And I didn't find that this was the case for any other group that was having their work shown, if they were having their work shown at a mainstream museum. Second, the object labels for work by Black artists stated that the artists were Black. However, labels for work by white artists did not identify them as white. That also seemed curious to me. And third, when an exhibition of work by Black artists was on view, the majority of museum visitors who commented about the exhibition to me as someone who worked at a museum or in the comment books stated that they had never seen an artwork by a Black artist before. And they believed that the exhibition they were in was the first of its kind, and they wanted to know more. And those are three reasons that really pushed me towards writing this book. Museum exhibitions have crucial significance for African Americans who have been historically marginal to the art museum as artists, as visitors, and museum professionals, but whose image in American art has served a didactic and often supportive role in nationalism and art history. I'll just say a little bit because I haven't said anything yet about the cover of this book. So when I was publishing the book, I wanted to have a photograph of Black people in a museum. Quickly realized there weren't any that I could find, and so was able to direct a photo shoot. And so this is in the American galleries at LACMA. This is now going to be a historical photo because all the buildings are being torn down. So I am honored to have my parents sitting on the bench in the gallery. So my mom is looking at Mary Cassatt's Mother About to Wash Her Sleepy Child, and my dad's looking at Winslow Homer's The Cotton Pickers. And these are two important 19th century paintings in LACMA's collection. But I was thinking about my mom looking at a representation of motherhood and not seeing herself in terms of race and class, but looking at a kind of image of motherhood that probably was not completely like her own. And maybe she did really relate to this painting, but you have to kind of do a stretch. My mom would have to stretch a little bit to identify with Mary Cassatt. Both of my parents picked and plucked cotton and have talked to us about the difference. But seeing this kind of representation of African American people, these two young women, in this painting, the representation of Black people as laborers, I don't have any objection to that, only I'm concerned when that's the only type of representation you see of who we are. So I wanted to have them contemplating these two images, and then the blurry person, the liminal person is me, representing myself as author, sometimes curator, but also in a bigger way thinking about what is the presence and absence of African American people in the museum. And then the man who we see partially on the right side of the book is Abraham Agonafir, who, if you've gone to LACMA regularly, you will recognize him as one of the guards. He's an Egyptian American immigrant, trained as an engineer and an architect, and then unable to work in those positions coming to the United States unless he retrained and got a national degree. Brilliant man, and for 25 years, people just asked him where the bathroom was, you know. So there's a lot of different things going on in this photo. In the introduction to his book titled Exhibiting Contradiction, Essays on Art Museums in the United States, author Alan Wallach writes about his realization about the role of the art museum exhibition. And he says, "It became evident to me that by walking through a gallery space hung with pictures, museum visitors acted out and thus, in some sense, internalized a version of art history. While it crystallizes a social truth about the role of art museums as instructive institutions, the exhibition space is a powerful one that does more than fulfill the seemingly simple function to display objects of creative expression. Exhibitions also have pedagogical roles to teach us the values of art, of culture, social movements, and national histories. And because of this particular significance, the exhibition space has been a contested one for African Americans. Internalized narratives of cultural and art history by the visiting public have made museum galleries critical spaces for Black representation, participation, and intervention. So my work in this area explores this demand for inclusion into the American art scene by African American people in historical and contemporary exhibition practices. So there are many examples that I could give you to precede the recent ones that I started with, some of which you can find in Exhibiting Blackness, and that's all I'm really going to say about the book. But I do want to discuss a couple of historical examples with you now. And I want to talk briefly about Harlem on My Mind, because if you learn anything about what not to do in terms of making an art exhibition about Black people, you need to know about Harlem on My Mind. In the latter half of the 20th century, mainstream interest in Black communities began in part because of the civil rights movement and Black American demands for social and economic parity with whites. Audiences were moved worldwide by nonviolent tactics met with violent responses, and civil protests met by brutal confrontation. Black Americans commanded the world's attention and insisted on increased public awareness of their national contributions and capabilities in the United States. This desire for Black recognition took many forms. In the visual arts, curators, artists, and art activists responded to the social ills of poverty, racism, and war in the 1950s and 60s through the prolific art production in all forms. The emergence of artist groups, the founding of museums and galleries dedicated to the visual expressions of Black people, and the confrontation of mainstream art museums that repeatedly ignored the history of African American art and culture were a major part for the surges for change during this moment. So the most notorious example of careless curating in this era is Harlem on My Mind, Cultural Capital of Black America, 1900 to 1968. That's the full title. And this exhibition happened at the Met in 1969, the same place where when Geshe Mutu just installed those amazing sculptures. The exhibition sought to trace the history and value of the predominantly Black community of Harlem in New York City. In organizing one of the most controversial exhibitions in United States history, the Met decided to exclude people from Harlem from participating in the planning of the exhibition and to exclude artwork by Harlem's thriving artist community. The museum justified these decisions by arguing that Harlem itself was a work of art, and the inclusion of artworks in Harlem on My Mind would only detract from the overall exhibition. I'm showing you a photograph by Lloyd Yearwood, who I'll talk about in a minute. This is just a photo of the facade when the exhibition was up. And just to give you a sense of what the show actually looked like. So the show was full of photographs and reproductions of documents, especially newspaper articles. It wasn't until the 1970s that photographs were considered art. Okay, and so the artists that were really organizing protests around the exhibition were painters, were sculptors, were working in fine art media as it was defined at the time, and did not want to be represented by mostly, but not exclusively, photojournalists who were not of the community. The exhibition was organized into decades, and the curators really were not concerned so much about content. They were very interested in what they were calling at the time advanced audio-visual presentations. So they had a closed-circuit television in the exhibition where you could watch people in Harlem on 125th Street. This kind of surveillance in the museum, and the museum was really excited about, look what we can do at the museum. They weren't interested in art and artists. They were interested in technology. There's a lot to say about this show. Also, these new ways it looks to us kind of like what you might see at a convention center. So not just using the flatness of the walls, but bringing these three-dimensional shapes and boxes, things hanging from the ceiling and taking different shapes, weighted on the ground. That was really exciting and new at the time in 1969. But there were people protesting. The Jewish Anti-Defamation League was protesting on one side of the museum because they were upset about some things said in the catalog, and African-American artists, particularly through a group called the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, it was a segregated protest before the exhibition even opened. I mean, there were just, it could have all been avoided, I can tell you that. And of course, I wasn't even born. So, but to do the research and to see what happened, it seems like there wasn't a whole lot of common sense that went into the planning. People needed to have conversations with each other about what was going on. One of the great things about the exhibition is that James Van Der Zee was really rediscovered through this exhibition, and these are photographs by him that you see here. So public frustration with the selection of objects and the depiction of cross-cultural relationships led to boycotts of the exhibition before it even opened. And Harlem on My Mind was the first exhibition at the Met that focused on Black Americans, and it was the only exhibition in its history, still to this date, that didn't include any art. Okay. So just to think about the significance of the Met, we think about the Met, MoMA, National Gallery. These are major influential institutions nationally and internationally. So it really sets a precedent when you make those kind of decisions. Okay. Harlem on My Mind is the touchstone exhibition for getting curating wrong. And it exemplified the anthropological and an ethnographic approach in mainstream art museums. I just want to show you this. I mentioned Lloyd Yearwood, who took that photograph of the facade. There was a real debate at the Met about what do they do with the current decade? How do you represent the 1960s? We're in it. There's all of this upset and social upheaval. What do we do? And so at the last moment, after the catalog was already printed, they decided, okay, we'll do the 60s. And so they put this call out in the Harlem newspapers. We're looking for somebody that takes pictures of Harlem today. And so Lloyd Yearwood said, well, I have pictures. And they said, okay, we need Malcolm X. So he said he came to the museum and he brought this portfolio and they picked things. And he was always, he's passed away now, but he was very upset that his work was never included in the catalog because it was this last minute decision. But we were looking at these pictures together and I said, where are these pictures taken? He said, Chicago. And I said, so, and he said, they wanted Malcolm. I followed Malcolm wherever he went. They didn't ask me where the pictures were taken because they didn't. Okay, and that's what we're talking about, careful curation, right? So some of these photographs were not even in Harlem. Okay. All right, there's more to say. Okay. So I want to share another example, fast forwarding closer to our time, of the continuation of the anthropological and really a sociological approach to showing art by Black artists. So every 15 years or so, either MoMA in New York or the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. decide to exhibit Jacob Lawrence's complete 60-paneled artwork called The Migration of the Negro that he made from 1940 to 1941. This is a real unprecedented artwork. There are 60 panels. He made the work when he was 22, another overly talented, gifted artist. And the museums fought over who could buy them. Sorry about that again. And so they separated the purchase odd and even. Okay, so to see the entire artwork, you have to see all 60 panels, but they're in different states. 30 are in one state, 30 are in another. So about every 15 years, one of them decides, I'm going to borrow yours and I'll show the whole thing. Okay, so look out for that. If you want to see the whole thing, you got to wait. Its most recent presentation was in 2015 when MoMA displayed Lawrence's work in an exhibit called One-Way Ticket. Basic elements of art such as color, line, shape, and composition, and common sources for analysis such as artistic style, influences, and innovation were not featured in the curatorial presentation through the wall text or the object labels. And although the work absolutely has narrative content, there is a relationship between the message and the medium. However, the migration of the Negro was presented less as an artwork and more as documentary illustration. The curators made a bank of computers, just giving you some more installation shots. So leading up to the entrance, you can see this timeline, social historical timeline of the migration of Black people from the South to the North and the West. In the middle of the exhibition was this table with all of these computers. Okay, and through digital content, the exhibition presented a team of experts of African American culture, history professors, authors, curators, performers, and others, to provide what the title wall called, and I'll just go back to that, Other Visions of the Great Movement North. Okay. And the title wall, at least here in the big header, it doesn't even have the title of the artwork. Okay. So this bank of computers and this other information formed a supplement to Lawrence's art, an informative source on the Great Migration, and ultimately a distraction away from the focus, the actual art that's in the room. You're in the room with the art, but come sit and look at this computer. So I want to cite art historian Elizabeth Berkowitz's astute analysis of the exhibition. She says, despite seemingly universal critical praise, MoMA's show failed to avoid the difficulty endemic to art historical emphasis on a non-white and therefore non-canonical artist. In a painstaking attempt to showcase and laud Lawrence and his work, a parade of good intentions, MoMA's One-Way Ticket inadvertently accomplished the opposite. One-Way Ticket fell into the trap of artistic pigeonholing as the exhibition classified Lawrence as a painterly historian of African American history rather than an American artist who used the visual and political interests of an interwar international art scene to create works which focused on African American subjects. And she goes on. One-Way Ticket unfortunately narrowed migration and Lawrence's framework of interpretation to race and race alone, preventing Lawrence and his work from signification within the aesthetic dialogue of modernism, and thereby perpetuating not only the art historical marginalization of a minority artist, but also suggesting the extent to which societal racial bias subtly manifests, even in cultural displays which aim to convey otherwise. That's the end of that quote. So typically and historically, presenting the art by someone who is Black has really stumped curators who decide that the work must be handled differently than other artists who are white, Americans or Europeans. Usually when MoMA has a panel or two on view of the artwork, they display it in a transitional area on a wall between galleries. And the curator's discomfort with the artwork as art was amplified in Lawrence's solo exhibition. So to be clear, the criticism here is not in the content of the supplementary material. This is just a screenshot of the website. And if you want to know more about the Great Migration, you should look at it. And this is a screenshot of some of the experts. So it's not criticizing the content as supplementary material. It's about the impulse to create other content and display it in the gallery instead of giving attention to the artists and their work. So historically, this impulse has been a recurring problem for art institutions. When given the opportunity to consider African Americans as artists and present their work with the same respect as artists who are not Black, the regular curatorial project is sidestepped. Harlem on my mind is our clearest example of that. But I was thinking, imagine Picasso's Guernica on the wall, right? And then a bank of computers with perspectives of experts about the Nazis' catastrophic violence in the Spanish Civil War. So sure, visitors may learn something about the war if they turn away from the art and sit to look at a website, but I think many would instead glance at the screens, because it's hard to ignore a screen, but then focus on the art. And they might even wonder, why would I want to look at a screen when the art is here in the same room, right? They might decide that neither Picasso nor Guernica needs supplementation in the museum. And I think that's debatable. I mean, some people might really find it enhancing, but it's something that we should be aware of. Thinking about curating with care, Berkowitz, the same person who was writing about One-Way Ticket, makes the following prescriptive point, and this is a shorter quote from her. In a curatorial framework, to acknowledge and deal with difference in a way with which both recognizes the specificity of experiences outside of a dominant white mainstream, one needs to first view the other as within the mainstream. End of quote. So this is an interesting idea, and I think it can be interpreted in different ways. The way that I was thinking about it is that the mainstream can only define itself as visible against a position of otherness that it creates. There has to be recognition of that construction of the other, along with acknowledgement of the differences and assertions of that role of the other. And instead of seeing Lawrence as an artist who made an artwork, MoMA disqualified Lawrence as eligible for equal treatment as an artist in the mainstream museum's collection. Instead, it treated Lawrence as a native informant through an anthropological lens. In that way, it reinscribes racial hierarchy within its collections and, in turn, its exhibitions. I feel like it was doing too much to cover for its anxiety. Okay, so here we are. I wanted to start with the gris-gris drawing that I talked about at the beginning of the walkthrough that we had a little bit earlier. With the instances of curatorial practices in mind that I've just rehearsed for you, let's turn to this exhibition at hand. What we find is that Gray is generous, I've said that word a dozen times and it's true, in the possibilities of engagement that he offers to us with his work. So first is the title of the exhibition, Euclidean Gris-Gris. Gray brings together multiple languages and traditions through the work to create a changing exhibition. The title signals a duality, a multiplicity to help ready us for our experience with the work. So the title has two parts. Euclidean, the geometric system culled from the teachings of ancient 3rd century BC Greek mathematician Euclid. I had to look that up. His formulas are foundational to the spatial organization of Western cultures. It provides the rationale and basis for logical visual systems in the West. So I was not familiar with this term until I looked it up for this show. And that struck me because the teachings of Euclid are so ingrained into the way that we think about spatial relationships and organization of public space that it was almost like I didn't need to know. I already knew what it was. I didn't even know it had a name. The second part of the definition, gris-gris, I'm going to use Gray's own definition of the term. He said, that which cannot be said but is. A cultural concept that comes from Afro-Caribbean traditions, not of European thought or practice, brought power to bring evil or good through an object, a thought, a word. People think about gris-gris as a spell or a curse. So Gray also has talked about how he wanted to make artwork, to be an artist, to reveal hegemony. And the Euclidean thinking provides a logical, rational order. Gris-gris works on another register to inform that order with will, desire, beauty, and spirit. Together we have two different forms of knowing that are in confrontation. So what comes out of that pairing? Is it war or is it collaboration? What is upset And how is what we know already reorganized? Okay, I also want to briefly, I'm almost at the end, just offer some different ways that we can approach the work. Okay, so the first pairing is presentation, representation. This is something in the field of visual studies that we talk about a lot. When you approach a work of art, are you approaching it as an object that is presented to you, or are you focused on what is being depicted? Okay. Visual presentation of the object has a presence and takes up space in the gallery. It is hung, it is lit, it is visible and presented, right? Consider our procession to the gallery, past the gree-gree drawing, representing, I don't know what it's representing, but helping us think about different ideas, biology, life, systems, playfulness, right? Something that's not precise. Bless you. Imagine the sound of making the work. Imagine the time that passes. What happens to your mind with that repetition? It's a time-based process that involves the body. So Gray's body and mind was involved in this making of this work, in the movement as our bodies move up and down the stairs. So there's a connection of experience here with the body. Yeah, I'll stay here for just another 10 seconds. Then there's representation, right? How do we perceive and understand what we see? What do we perceive as the subject matter? What is depicted in the pictures? And I'd like us to be reminded of Professor Jackson's insight this weekend that Gray, this is a quotation from you, I was listening, uses photography to get us to think beyond what we know. And I thought that was a really profound and elegant way for us to think about what he's doing with photography in this work. Another way that we can approach the work is through a conceptual lens, so presentation, representation, that kind of schism, but then now I'm talking about another one, conceptual. What does it mean to be denied access to the subject of a work of art? To see but not possess with the eye. How does Gray's work tell us, or what does Gray's work tell us about desire, our desires, and colonial desire, and post-colonial desire? The desire for land, for African resources, and for sources, right? Sources of labor. The desire for access. I was thinking about the earlier work where he has Michael Jackson. The desire for access to celebrities. The desire for black bodies, for a source of black bodies for labor and also for entertainment. How does the structure of Gray's work ignore boundaries of painting, photography, and sculpture to dislocate our expectations of a work of art? What does the work ask us to do? What do we need to reconsider? It refuses to cater to voyeuristic desires, refusing the impulse to consume the exotic otherness of African people, but instead to see the construction and the process of making vision. And I think his work causes desire in us because I want to move things around so that I can see it the way I want to see it, and he's not letting me have that power. Another way for us to approach the work is thinking about the technical and visual aspects. I was thinking about this work, which we looked at briefly in the show. Thinking about the work on the level of construction, how Gray uses objects together to create new forms. One thing over another. One thing sits beside something else. Stacking and layering, which is mentioned in the wall text. I think of Romare Bearden's description of his own process when he says, I really think the art of painting is the art of putting something over something else. And this works in Gray's work, technically, visually, and conceptually. Thinking about color blocks, how do they change the way we see the landscape? We had a good conversation about some of these ideas, that when the color is like these purples, these really vivid colors, are overlaid, become part of the image, it changes our approach and our expectations of the work. Maybe we feel that it's not as serious, maybe it's more playful. When you get up close, you can also see the digitalization of the work, the pixels, which makes me think about screen culture, which all of us are, so dependent on now. It makes us think about representation, looking at something through the lens of someone else. Okay, how do these color blocks in this particular work, The Tropic of Entropy, how do they change the way that we see the landscape? When would we see a landscape like the ones that are represented here? Where are we? When do we see those colors? How does each element change the other, the landscape and the color? In Gifty Versailles, what does it mean to see a landscape in this kind of framing where you have the horizon line tipped to become the vertical, right? Is that right? The horizon line, yeah, tipped to become more vertical. It's hard to talk about verticals in this, right? Because you've got a depth of field. But the way that it's turned on its side, how does it feel to see the ground turned up from under you? We present it visually as if it's on its edge. How does Gray's vision change our vision? This is the work, the mission, and the function of an artist, right? Artists are there to help us see something differently. Another way to think about his work is through the private, personal, and the public. I'll just skip to this one. I mentioned this earlier and said I'd show it again. So in the earlier works from the beginning of this new form that he's created, there were many photos taken by Gray of Michael Jackson. So they combined Gray's own lived experience as an artist who actually knew him and Gray's experiences living in Akwida, Ghana. So we see this mix of the private and the personal in his work. It pushes us to consider what we know, I think, also about Africa. For most Americans, Africa is a place that is still known best through misinformation and lack of information. I also wanted to point out that there's a lot of repetition in his work, so that we have this person in this boat, this kind of canoe, blocking Chuck Berry's and MJ's face, but that we see this in other works as well. Atlanta by Boat. The inner portrait framed of a person continues in other works. And this is something that makes me think about how all of us are bombarded with a repetition of images, right? I think it's incessant. How do images maintain their meanings and also shift meanings in new contexts and in different moments? What do we bring to the work to see it in all of its different significations? So I'll end now with these thoughts that I hope help us think critically about images through the gift that Gray has given us through this exhibition. Our job in curating carefully is really to pay attention. We should always allow the work to resonate on multiple registers. Do not limit the work. Do not reduce the artist in their capacity and ability for vision. Let the work signify as we engage with it through our own knowledges. It's only through this vulnerability and communication that we can ever do better. Thank you. All right. It's okay. Just leave it all on the floor.
We've sort of made a decision to push the Q&A over to the gallery to let people go. Or is that cool? Can you get that? Okay. So Bridget will be available in the gallery to talk. The way to seduce you to come over to the gallery is if they have cupcakes, or is it cupcakes? From Southern Girls Bakery in South Los Angeles. Sugar.